An entry-level price camera with a professional processor. This is the Nikon Z52. So let's talk about the Nikon Z52. Obviously, it's an upgrade from the Nikon Z50, and I would say a substantial upgrade in comparison. As I said before, this camera has a professional processor, the X-Speed 7, which you will find in higher-end Nikon cameras like the Nikon Z8, Nikon Z9, and Nikon Z3. So what you're getting here with this camera is you're getting a camera that has better autofocus, better colors, all around it's just a better camera. Get rid of the Nikon Z50. The Nikon Z52 is a substantial upgrade. First off, talking about the body, when you compare this to the Z50, there is a noticeable difference. The Z52 is a little bit bigger, a little bit more taller, so more attractive to women. It weighs roughly 465 grams, where the Nikon Z50 weighs 395 grams. Not a huge weight difference, and if it is a bit too heavy for you, I don't know what to tell you, hit the gym. Otherwise, it is a great build camera. Another great thing about this camera is it does have more buttons. The Nikon Z50 was rather limited in buttons. I think it put a bunch of them on the touch screen, and that's not great. As a photographer or videographer, I do like to be able to navigate my camera with touch alone. Sometimes you're in a dark space, you want to be able to run your hands on the camera rather easily. Other great physical features about this camera is you do of course have a USB-C port on the side here, so you can power directly into this USB-C port. So if you don't trust the battery, you can just use a power bank to power directly into the camera. Also, a great thing about this USB-C port is you actually can use this camera as your primary streaming camera. All you have to do is plug this camera in via the USB-C port into your streaming device and you're ready to go. You don't have to mess around with any weird apps, it's just a plug and play camera. Other things about this camera is you also do have an additional jack port on the side here for your headphones. Also, with the SD card, you only have a single SD card port in here. I obviously would have liked an additional SD card port or a CF Express port, but you know, with the smaller camera, you are working with less or fewer cards, so it's just something I have to live with. Single SD card, it's not that bad. This camera works great with it anyway. You also do have a tally light on the front of this camera here. So when you're recording video, the little light will go on. That's pretty special. Another thing that doesn't get mentioned a lot is that this camera also does have its own inbuilt flash. So if you don't have a flash, you're in a dark space, you have the flash on this camera right here. You also have two custom function buttons on the front of the camera. Major difference between this and the Nikon Z50 is you now have a vari-angle flip screen. The Nikon Z50 originally had a tilt screen that went to about 180 degrees. Weird angle, but a lot of photographers would have preferred that. But it really does show with the Nikon Z52 that they are leaning towards more the content creator, the people that are going to be, I guess, in front and behind the camera. So having a vari-angle flip screen is more practical. Another thing I noticed about this flip screen is that when I rotate the camera into a vertical position for, you know, Instagram or whatever, the display will actually rotate with it. So it's making this camera much easier for a lot of you content creators out there. Now, in terms of image quality, what you're working with here is a 20.9 megapixel sensor. It's nothing too special. It's not a CMOS or stacked or anything like that. It's all in all just a solid bit of sensor. As you can see from the photos here, you are getting some great image quality. Auto mode on this camera also works particularly well. I don't find any of the highlights getting blown out or any too strong of contrast. Now, as well as what you're getting with here, you can of course shoot with RAW and JPEG simultaneously. And if you want to shoot in RAW at burst mode, you go up to 11 frames per second. But in JPEG, you can shoot up to 30 frames per second, which is a full second of photos, which is going to be great for when you say I have to take photos of birds or something taken off and you're terrible at timing like me. But the video is where I think this camera does just leaps and bounds above the Z50. What you're working with here is effectively at its best resolution. You have 4K at 5.6 oversampled. So pretty much 4K, but a little bit better at H.265, 10-bit, great color range, and in a video format of N-Log1. Now what's so special about N-Log1 is basically you have more details in the shadows and highlights of your images. So your image isn't going to be as crunched, and if you want to say drag this in post or adjust the colors on the video, you do have more options with N-Log1. So that is a great sort of format to have in such a small camera. As a colorist, it's just a great more detailed imagery and options in post-production as well. Now, in terms of other video formats, you are working with 100 to 120 frames per second in HD, which isn't too special, but I do notice when I'm shooting in that, the frame does go a bit wider. So I got to assume that when I'm shooting 4K at 25 frames per second, the image is cropping in a bit. And of course, you can also shoot at 60 to 50 frames per second, but you will find that there is actually a fair bit of crop at full HD. Now with the N-Log option and having more coloring options, you do have a cool feature inside this camera called the picture control. What this basically is it's a series of custom colorings inside the camera that you can select to give your footage a very particular look. Now, of course, you can sort of customize these customizable color selections inside the camera. You can also download or share your own custom colorings online with people, so you can very much play around and get a very unique look with this camera working with the N-Log. With photo though, it's a bit of a different story. If you are shooting RAW, yes, the picture control features will show up on the photos you take inside this camera, but once you drag those RAW photos with that picture control on them into, say, Photoshop or Lightroom, you will notice that the picture control just isn't there. Now, a major thing about this camera is the autofocus. You of course do have your standard hybrid phase contrast autofocus, but thanks to the XSpeed 7 processor inside this camera, the autofocus has just shot way up. So with this autofocus, you can identify not just humans, dogs, and cats like you could with the Z50, but you can also identify trains, vehicles, planes, bikes, motorcycles, and it's also all around just better and stickier autofocus with the aforementioned subjects. So now the autofocus will actually persist a great deal more with people, with animals, particularly locking onto their eye. Doesn't matter if someone sort of walks in the way, the autofocus will quickly latch back on. So very sticky autofocus in such a small camera. That's going to be very reliable for a lot of us. I mean, often I would be sort of operating this camera at full extension, 100 mils, and the autofocus was still working great, even with the camera shaking around. So great autofocus all in all. The camera also does have a product review mode, which basically means any object that comes into the foreground will be pulled into focus. So if you want to hold makeup, Pokemon cards, or any other sort of product in front of you while presenting to camera, this camera right here will automatically pull focus onto that object. So it doesn't matter if the object is, say, off the side. You don't have to hold the object directly in front of you for autofocus to be pulled. It will automatically go, that object's in the foreground, I gotta focus on that object. Of course, this does also mean that if you gesticulate a lot with your hands, you might find the autofocus is getting routinely pulled during this product review mode, but of course it is quick to latch back onto your face again. All in all, the product review mode on this camera is very efficient, it's very reliable, it's great. Now in terms of stabilization, unfortunately this camera does not have any IBIS, so that's not great. I prefer to have that, everyone prefers to have that. What you do have in this camera though is vibration reduction. So this will help to absorb a great deal of the shakes in your own hands. So it's going to be ideal if you have to stand stationary with this camera and sort of assess people, you know, in the situations when you don't have a tripod. But if you have to sort of pan or track, you will sort of start to notice a bit of shaking in the footage. At least I notice it. I'd much rather put this camera on a gimbal if I have to pan, track, or move around with it. But otherwise, the vibration reduction does work fairly well when you're sort of hand holding it and it's static. And if it's not good enough, you do have an option for an electronic vibration reduction, which is another additional vibration reduction placed on top. When you flick this on, it will obviously crop the footage in, but it also will stabilize the footage significantly. Now this stabilization for electronic vibration isn't available to the 50 to 60 frames per second 4K video footage. So unfortunately you don't have an option there as it's already cropped in, but other resolutions you are good to go. Except when you reach to 100 frames to 120 frames HD, you also do not have that electronic vibration option either. So I'd much rather turn those two fins off and stabilize in post-production anyway. So that's the Nikon Z52. All in all, it is a substantial upgrade from the Nikon Z50, and it is great to have the autofocus performance of higher end cameras like the Z8 or the Z9 inside a more affordable camera. And it is good to say that this camera does have great video quality. N-Log option, that is fantastic. I can take this camera's footage into post-production and trust that I'm getting some great level quality footage. In terms of sort of, I guess, shortcomings I would say about this camera, I wasn't crazy about the fact that I can't just shoot pure N-Log. I do have to sort of shoot N-Log with a picture profile over everything. Would have liked that option for just N-Log RAW where I could color grade in post. But for a lot of people who are buying this camera, maybe they are just sort of starting out. Maybe you just want something that can quickly shoot your quality footage. So that's not going to be a huge issue for you. In terms of other sort of, I guess, shortcomings, really, it's a pretty good camera. For the price that it is, obviously, it doesn't have a bunch of other features. In-body stabilization, that would have been nice, but it's a more affordable camera, but with great, fantastic professional autofocus and beautiful colors. So if you're looking to get into photography or videography and don't want to spend a whole lot, but still want something that comes out looking nice, the Nikon Z52 is a great option for you. But let me know what you think of the Nikon Z52. Is it worth the upgrade from the Nikon Z50? What features are you most excited about? Let me know in the comments below.